Two hands clap and there is a sound. What is the sound of one hand? Hello and welcome to a new type of episode of Bright on Buddhism called the Kōan Series. In the Kōan Series, we will read and discuss famous koans used by real Buddhist monks from such sources as the Blue Cliff Record, the Gateless Gate, the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and many others. Full disclosure, this is not how koans are used or ought to be used in Buddhist practice, but I'm here to give some extra context and meaning to some of these koans so that you might see them in a new light and gain some new or deeper meaning from them than you did before. I hope you enjoy. Today's koan is known in English as the question, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" This koan was authored by a famous Japanese Zen Buddhist known as Hakuin Eikaku in the 18th century. If you remember from our previous episode on koans, this is one of the first koans which will be given to a practitioner to meditate on when they join a monastery and begin their training. For more details on that process, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism episode 32, What are Koans? And for more on Zen Buddhism, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism episode 10, What is Zen? I'll include links to those in today's show notes. In short, koans are phrases and questions that are a part of Zen or Chan Buddhist practice. They are often seemingly meaningless or nonsensical phrases or unanswerable questions given to a practitioner by a master to meditate on. The practitioner commonly strives to observe the phrase or to meditate on a particular unusual phrase until you have reached the point of some higher understanding or awakening. This practice is thought to help a practitioner come to some sudden deep understanding or awakening that is known as satori in Japanese. Think of it like an aha moment on steroids. In the last episode, we started by establishing some doctrines and concepts that exist in Buddhism around that particular koan, which give it context, and I would like to do the same thing again here. As I have said before and will say again, koans are not meant to be understood intellectually, but as a scholar, I would like to offer up the deeper meanings and contexts that are at play in a given koan so that they are more widely understandable and richly meaningful. The three concepts at play in this koan, as I understand it, that I would like to offer up my expertise in are the understanding of sound in Buddhism, the understanding of silence in Buddhism, and the concept of non-duality. Let's start with the concept of sound in Buddhism. Sound is one of the 12 ayatanas and one of the 18 dhatus. These are concepts in Buddhism that explain the experience of sensations and the arising of craving or desire. The 12 ayatanas are the 6 sense organs plus their sense objects, or the things that they sense. These are the eyes and visible objects, ears and sound, nose and smells, tongue and tastes, body and touch, and mind and mental objects. When we add 6 forms of 6 consciousnesses, we get the 18 dhatus. These are visual cognition, auditory cognition, smell cognition, taste cognition, body cognition, and mind cognition. This system provides a matrix which serves several purposes in the Buddhist system. First and foremost, this establishes the Buddhist understanding of cognition experience as it relates to the arising of desire and craving, and therefore suffering. In an episode of cognition experience, let's call it, let's imagine that we just start with a visual object. When not perceived by a sentient being, this is just an object which has the characteristic of being able to be seen. This itself is karmically inert. Then imagine we have included a sentient being with sight and with eyes into the mix, and they see that object. Eyes and sight themselves are also karmically inert. These two alone are not the entire picture, however. We are missing an important component. We are missing visual cognition. One of the characteristics of sentient beings is the constant co-presence of cognition, which measures and examines and analyzes and categorizes all sensory experience according to one's karma and one's past experiences and memories. This is the karmically activated component of sensation and experience, and it is visual cognition. When a sentient being visually cognizes something, that something is then categorized as good, bad, or neutral, and we immediately judge it accordingly. If I were to see an image of a violent crime happening on the street, or an ugly image, or a disgusting image, I would immediately register that as bad and judge that I desire for its absence. Similarly, if I were to see a beautiful landscape, a piece of artwork, or another pleasant image, I would desire for more pleasurable stimuli. These desires are insatiable, and that is the arising of suffering. That is the situation that we are in here in samsara, and it seems pretty hopeless. There does not seem to be anything that can be done. The Buddha argues, however, that there is. He argues that this cycle can be broken at any step. There are karmically good sensory stimuli, there are karmically good judgments of things, and there are karmically good desires to have. Remember, however, that karmic good is not the end goal. Karmic good is very good and better than karmic bad, but the end goal is a non-karmic existence, which is defined as nirvana. However, we need to accrue enough karmic good to even put ourselves in a position where we would have the opportunity for nirvana. Therefore, we ought to strive to fill our cognition and experience with karmic good as much as we can while we exist in samsara. This means all 6 sensory objects, including sound, but it also includes our beliefs and our behaviors. However, this also begs a critically important question. What are karmically good sounds? There are many answers to this question, and for more detail, I'll direct you to Bright on Buddhism, episode 18, What is the Buddhist Philosophy of Speech, Language, and Words? I'll include the link to that one in the show notes as well. One answer is that the words of the sutras are karmically good. It is often argued that the sound of the sutras, to say nothing of their content, accrues good karma, delights the listener, assists in mindfulness, and so on. This answer is very common among all forms of Buddhism, and it is why recitation of the sutras is extremely popular as a ritual. Another answer is that the name of the Buddha himself is karmically good. Saying, "Praise be to ex-Buddha," is said to create a karmic connection between the practitioner and that Buddha and entangle that person in a cycle of fate wherein you will be connected to that Buddha in some way. You may be reborn in their realm, you may hear that Buddha preach to you directly someday, and you may even hear that Buddha prophesize your future enlightenment and Buddhahood someday. These are all good things. The answer to the original question, what sounds are karmically good, that I wanted to focus on for this episode comes from the esoteric Buddhist tradition. This tradition is very popular in Tibet, Mongolia, and in parts of Japan. The central argument of this branch of Buddhism, which is also known as Vajrayana or Shingon Buddhism, is that all of reality constitutes a world text where everything, all sentient beings, all sense objects, all ideas, thoughts, actions, all small d dharmas in reality, all make up letters and words of this great dharma which the cosmic Buddha, Vairocana, is preaching to himself for his own delight. This world text is also itself the body of Vairocana. So we are the body of the cosmic Buddha, which is made of words and letters, which Vairocana is preaching to himself for his own amusement. This is a wild concept to wrap one's head around, but it's why I bring up the issue of sound. This koan asks what the sound of something is. If you think about this esoteric Buddhist concept I have just brought up, you are immediately confused trying to answer this question, because in this esoteric Buddhist system, what actually is and is not sound? Remember that we are all letters and words of this world body text, and we are Vairocana preaching to himself. Are we written words, which contain form and meaning in relation to other words, or are we spoken words, which would make us sounds with meaning? The answer is actually both. In esoteric Buddhism, the root Sanskrit syllable a is thought of as being the foundation for all of the physical form of reality. This syllable itself is thought of as having form, and it serves as the foundation for everything that we commonly regard as physical. This is sort of where a lot of the New Agey talk about vibrations come from. They say we are all vibrations of varying pitch and amplitude, and that's what accounts for our varying physical characteristics and properties. This includes everything in reality, including people, objects, and other animals and other sentient beings, and so on. I won't comment on very much of that. I'm here to stick to the Buddhist stuff, but that is where a lot of that New Agey talk is coming from. The root syllable is the foundation of any spoken word. Ah is the sound that we have to make with our mouth before even changing the shape of our mouth to make any other particular sound. In the same way, it is the root syllable that Vairocana utters before he changes the pitch and tone and whatnot for the myriad things in reality to take shape. How does this relate to the question of karmically good or bad sounds? Well, because of everything I just mentioned, esoteric Buddhism and much of Mahayana Buddhism in general regards all sounds as being karmically good, because they are all part of the great sermon of Vairocana. If every single word that the Buddha preaches is supposed to be karmically good, as it is argued in the sutras, then of course everything that the Buddha preaches, being everything in the world body text, would also be karmically good. That's because they all arise from this auspicious root syllable, and therefore contain Buddha nature within all of them. They all teach something, as long as you're willing to listen. So what about silence? In Buddhism, silence can play a very important role as well. Let's consider this a little bit. What do we mean in English when we say the phrase, a pregnant pause? What is the pause, or the silence, actually pregnant with? The answer is that it's pregnant with meaning. There is something that is being communicated by the speaker's choice to remain silent. It could be contempt, it could be happiness, it could be a complex mix of emotions that can't possibly be distilled into a few words. What is most important about it is that the meaning that it communicates is highly context dependent. It is mutually interdependent on what is being said and what has been said and communicated on either side of the pregnant pause. The context itself is what impregnates the silence with meaning. So we have established that sometimes, and only sometimes, silence serves the purpose of communicating meaning, and that the meaning that it communicates is informed by the context of that communication. Now, all other silences, silence that just exists in the absence of sound, all other silences can be thought of as not being pregnant, and they don't have any sort of meaning attached to them. However, we're going to see that the esoteric Buddhists would argue otherwise. Regardless, in those special cases where silence is pregnant with meaning, in the absence of our mouths moving to create spoken words, we are engaging in some kind of mind-to-mind communication. We're essentially communicating telepathically. Never mind whether the information actually jumps the gap successfully and the intended message is received. We are simply talking to each other with our thoughts alone. Well, call me crazy, but wouldn't you say that words work the exact same way? Words also serve the purpose of communicating a meaning to another party, and the meaning of that word is contextually dependent on the meanings and contexts of every other word. Therefore, words are also a form of mind-to-mind communication. This very idea of mind-to-mind communication comes up in the birth of all Zen Buddhism, as it is told by Zen Buddhists throughout history, in a famous scene in what is called the Flower Sermon. In this scene, the Buddha picks up a white flower and admires it fondly. The surrounding disciples were confused, and they didn't understand what was going on, except for Mahakāssyapa, who is regarded as the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism. Mahakāssyapa, who was one of the Buddha's original 10 disciples, apparently picked up on what the Buddha was trying to communicate, and he merely smiled faintly in response. Seeing this, the Buddha told Mahakāssyapa that he alone, out of the assembly, understood what he had intended to teach, the mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma. This scene proved to be transformative for Zen Buddhism. Mind-to-mind transmission of the Dharma is one of the most primary emphases of Zen Buddhism over other schools of Buddhism, so much so that branches of Japanese Zen, such as Soto, have come to phase out the use of koans as a teaching and learning tool because they rely on language as a means of communication. There is a similar scene to this one in Chapter 8 of the Vimalakirti Sutra. In this chapter, Vimalakirti, the playboy rock star of the Bodhisattva path, enters into a contest with the assembled disciples of the Buddha. This contest is to see who can give the most accurate and apt description of non-duality. Everybody goes around trying to put this concept into words, and yet everybody fails. Even Manjushri takes a crack at it, and he is the most advanced and knowledgeable of the Buddha's 10 disciples. However, Manjushri actually loses, and Vimalakirti, quote-unquote, wins when it comes to be his turn, and his statement is to remain completely silent. This has been widely read as a discreditation of the usefulness of language in communicating anything. It's been read as a critique of words as being dualistic, and many people interpret Vimalakirti's silence to be a realization or a communication of non-dualism in the only way that can actually work. However, this doesn't quite work for me. I've argued that because silence and words work in essentially the same way, it was not the silence which communicated the meaning of non-duality that Vimalakirti was trying to get across, but its skillful deployment in the context of the contest and the competing opinions of non-duality that everybody was giving. Indeed, words are dualistic and are insufficient in communicating ideas fully. I can't describe the taste of chocolate to you if you have never tasted it and expect you to understand it. If silence works similarly to words, then silence can't communicate fully either. Sound and silence itself is a duality, and we ought to strive for non-dualism. Anyways, we are now getting around to an important component of the question of the koan. When I ask you what the sound of one-hand clapping is, you'll be inclined to say silence. Knowing what you know now about words versus silence, this koan challenges you to ask a couple of important questions, like, can words in silence actually describe and communicate meaning completely and effectively? What does that specific silence, the silence of one-hand clapping, actually communicate? Hence, the final point I wanted to discuss in the context of this koan, non-duality. Non-duality is a very important doctrinal point in Buddhism that first comes up in the work of Nagarjuna, the famous 1st century Madhyamaka Buddhist thinker who wrote on emptiness and the middle way. The doctrine is rarely present in the earliest Sanskrit sutras, but comes up in the later Mahayana texts, and also serves as a descriptor for English language scholars for one of the dimensions of the middle way philosophy and the philosophy of emptiness. For more on those, see Bright on Buddhism Episode 6, What is the Middle Way, and Episode 33, What is Emptiness? I will link those in the show notes. The doctrine of non-duality, or Advaya in Sanskrit, refers to the idea that a dualistic perspective of the world around us is an incomplete and categorically limited view. If we were to think that X is not Y and Y is not X, we are not expressing the correct understanding of emptiness and impermanence. Judging that X is not Y and Y is not X assumes that X and Y contain some fundamental, independent, and unique existence apart from one another, which is not true due to the doctrines of emptiness and impermanence. And it requires the application of labels and signifiers by our own flawed cognition as a means of defining them against each other. And that alone arises from delusion and perpetuates delusion. Let's look at a couple of concrete examples to make this make more sense. Imagine that I see a cup and a bowl. I judge that the cup is not a bowl and the bowl is not a cup because they have different shapes, different functions, they're made of different materials, and they're called different names, and so on. That, however, ignores their commonalities, which are that they are vessels for food or water, they may be made from the same or similar non-living components, and my label as cup or bowl is context dependent, with that context being the cultural understandings and applications of wares that happen to be this or that shape. For example, in Japan, they have sometimes used in history what we might think of in the West as a wooden box as a drinking vessel. Those things are wishy-washy, is my point. This example applies even more heavily to extremes in the world, such as nihilism or eternalism, moral good and moral bad, etc. Nihilism, or the idea that the world is random chaos and therefore nothing has a purpose or reason, misunderstands emptiness and impermanence because although things are always changing and nothing has a substantial existence, there is the existence of causality, which lends itself to a relative continuity. Good begets good and bad begets bad. This happens almost 100% of the time. That still holds up. Of course, eternalism, or the idea that everything exists substantially and in an unchanging way and that souls exist and must be treated as such, misunderstands the fact that things can actually change, decay, die, and are reborn. The reality that we experience exists in the middle of those two extremes. One extreme being nothing exists at all and nothing makes sense or has any sense of order, and the other extreme being that everything exists and has a sense of order. There is only relative continuity, but things do change. And this gray area in the middle, this middle way, is a state of non-duality that transcends both of those extremes. Morality is similar. It is argued in Buddhism that good and bad are contextual, and that good and bad each contain good and bad within them, and that good and bad are made up of standards which change over time, and so therefore true morality transcends good and bad. Non-duality, as we have mentioned, applies to language as well. It is argued that words are inherently dualistic because they define themselves against all other words and are therefore insufficient in communicating non-duality itself. However, we must use them because we don't really have any other options. And that's okay, because although they're dualistic, they can be skillfully and appropriately used in order to lead somebody off the cliff, so to speak, and facilitate their experience of non-duality. Non-duality, as we have mentioned so far, is a dimension of emptiness. Distinctions, however necessary they may be for various purposes, are empty and wishy-washy, and they are therefore not useful in themselves for diagnosing the true nature of reality. If we were to apply this principle of non-duality in the context of the koan, then we would see that we ought to interrogate the duality between sound and silence. This is where we come back around to the esoteric Buddhist doctrine of the world-body text of Vairocana. Silence, as we've said before, is one of Vairocana's letters or words that he uses to preach to us, and we also said that all of the words and letters of this world-body text are written but also spoken. That means that silence itself is still the speech of Vairocana, and the speech of Vairocana necessarily has provisional form, relative continuity, and the nature of Buddha Vachana, or the Buddha's speech, namely that it is enlightening, delightful, and is itself the Dharma. That being the case, when we answer the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping, by physically saying the word silence with our mouths, we are not necessarily wrong. How much more correct, then, if we answer the question by saying nothing at all? Given these three concepts, I would like to offer a final analysis of the koan. Victor Sogen Hori comments on this koan in his book, Translating the Zen Phrase, that the central meaning and theme of this koan is non-duality. He characterizes a monk's journey with this koan as being broken up into several stages. In the first stage, he writes, "In the beginning, a monk first thinks a koan is an inert object upon which to focus attention." I argue that this is the stage when the monk is trying to answer the question of the koan. When somebody gives you a math problem, you focus on it and look at what kind of answer would satisfy the problem. Then you reach another stage. He writes about this next stage. After a long period of consecutive repetition, one realizes that the koan is also a dynamic activity, the very activity of seeking an answer to the koan. This is where the duality that the monk might imagine between themselves and the question of the koan is starting to break down. They are seeing the koan as not being inert, but rather being activity itself, and they are starting to see the sameness in the activity of the koan and their own mental activity. He writes about when the monk fully breaks down the distinction between self and koan. The koan is both the object being sought and the relentless seeking itself. In a koan, the self sees self not directly but under the guise of the koan. For Victor Sogen Hori, silence just might be the answer. He regards this koan as offering a duality, namely the idea of two hands clapping, then challenging the practitioner to consider non-duality by offering singularity, the one hand clapping, as a nudge in the direction of non-duality, which I speculate must be silence. In that regard, I read this koan as having 3 performative stages, which should be the exact same stages that the practitioner ought to proceed through in his own consideration of the koan. These are the stages of two hands clapping, then one hand clapping, and then silence. I read that silence as being a transmission of the Dharma. If the monk and the koan are both proceeding accordingly, then they are indeed non-dual, and the monk receives the Dharma according to the pattern of the koan. Thus, the seeming answer to this question, the answer that we ought to understand as being imbued due to the context, due to the non-duality, due to the nature of the reality of the Dharma, and due to the nature of silence itself as being. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. Tweet us at brightbuddhism. And join us on our Discord server, the Hidden Sangha, link in description. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.